Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar titled DevOps Adoption in the Real World: 3 Ways to Drive Test-Centric Continuous Delivery. This webinar is hosted by Micro Focus. Can you please go to the next? Thank you. And today I will be your host, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Again, this is Jay Joshi as your moderator. I've worked in the IT industry for over 20 years, helping customers adopt various best practices to increase the value to their organization. Joining me today will be Julian Fish, who is the Director of Product Management for Application Development and Release Orchestration. He drives the product strategy for application development and release orchestration within Micro Focus. He's also helped dozens of large organizations transition their application deployment and release management process from traditional to continuous delivery-based approaches. Joining him is Wes Goddard, who is the Senior DevOps Pre-Sales Engineer. He has worked with customers on their DevOps initiatives, helping them find the benefits across the software development lifecycle by looking at the group's process and tools. He has over 15 years of industry experience. Just before we get quick housekeeping. Today's slide deck, question answers, and on-demand recording will be made available to you and will be sent to everyone via email once the webinar is posted. If you have any questions as we go along, please type them into the questions pane in the webinar control panel shown on the next slide. Basically, to submit a question, click on the question pane, expand it, and then type your question and hit send. So without any further delay, let's jump right in and let me virtually hand the microphone over to Julian. Julian?
Thanks, Jay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Vivid Micro Focus webinar for today. We're going to be taking a look at 3 practices that can help you with your DevOps transformation, specifically with a focus on testing and test integration as part of your DevOps transformation policies. But before we start, let's set the scene a little bit. Let's take a look at the way the industry is looking for us at the moment. And I think a good place to start, taking a sort of lead from some of our analyst friends, in this case Gartner, a pretty astounding figure in my mind: 80% of DevOps initiatives are going to fail to deliver the business requirement set of them through 2021. Basically, unless organizations deal with and try to adopt a better way of working and to be able to implement the process and practices around DevOps in a suitable way. Realistically, what we're looking at here is making sure that the organizations that you work for, the organizations that we help transition to DevOps transformation practices and policies and working capabilities, basically need to help and be able to implement acceleration of delivery and being able to drive an improvement in quality through the business. Ultimately, what we're looking to do from an end user perspective and from a business perspective is move fast without breaking things. Let's think about that from a couple of different angles. If I'm a tester, why do I care about how fast the organization moves? Well, from a testing perspective, the faster the business moves, the faster the development organization moves, the faster the deliverables from the development organization come into my backlog for me to work against. I used a particular agile phrase then when I said backlog, but ultimately the list of activities that I need to be able to deliver against. If I'm a business analyst, why do I need to be able to move more quickly? Well, I need to be able to deliver business value as quickly as possible. The days of IT being a supporting factor for business are long, long gone. The reality now is for almost all of the organizations that we as Micro Focus and you as practitioners working through our visit partners actually deliver against is the fact that IT is a compelling part of every single deliverable that goes out of the door from a business perspective. It's almost impossible to deliver a non-IT function to a business that's going to drive business advantage. Yes, you can potentially increase things, for example, reducing time to market through real-time delivery or just-in-time delivery, But ultimately, practices like just-in-time delivery, let's think about the retail industry as an example, being able to get capabilities around, let's say, a new product into market. You can reduce the time by just-in-time delivery, but all the systems that deliver and function just-in-time delivery tools are driven through IT processes and IT improvements and have been over the last 15, 20 years. From the operations perspective, as I'm dealing with all of this change coming through from the business, I need to be able to deliver in a structured manner. I need to be able to deliver it in a way that doesn't impact my system uptime. Again, because IT is now a core constituent part of our business, we can't afford to have system outages. We can't afford to have any downtime. Having 6 nines availability or even higher for our end users is really, really critical. Therefore, the operations team still want to adhere to practices, for example, ITSM centric, ITIL centric practices, SLA-driven capabilities, saying to the business, hey, we may have an outage, but if we do have an outage, you'll be pre-notified about it. All of our end users will be aware of it. And again, from the development perspective, as the business applies more and more pressure to deliver change, we need to change our working practices. We need to go from the old school big bang way of delivering, where we're taking a V model or a waterfall type delivery practice and cadence, where we're delivering once every 3 months or once every 6 months, to a very, very short iteration-based delivery practice. That could be using agile project management methodologies. It could be using scaled agile methodologies, for example, things like SAFe or LESS or DART for enterprise-grade agile delivery. But ultimately, we need to be able to deliver in smaller iterations because it reduces the risk and it increases our ability to deliver our value features to market as quickly as possible. Now, obviously, there's a fairly significant juxtaposition there. We're talking about delivering more quickly in smaller increments from the development and the business side, but our operations guys still wanting to deliver things and manage the capabilities of when changes are delivered into production. So we need to be able to address that gap between the two. And we also need to make sure that our testing organizations don't get squeezed from both sides. We need to make sure that the dev team still integrates with the testing team. It doesn't throw things over the wall to a center of excellence that's going to be sitting there waiting for changes to come down the pipeline. And we also need to make sure that the operations team doesn't get things thrown to them from the testing organization. When I say things, net new releases of our application or multiple applications where we have multiple application dependencies and multiple testing teams, development teams, and operations functions working together to make sure our changes go out successfully. I guess another way to look at this is a slightly less linear approach where we have continuous iterations, we have continuous planning and governance taking place, we have continuing development and testing taking place, we have continuous deployment and release taking place, and we have continuous operations and monitoring. In fact, Jez Humble and David Farley wrote a book almost 10 years ago now, back in 2010, taking the practices of the Agile Manifesto and explaining the principles of things like continuous delivery being a key constituent way to help us deliver applications more quickly. And again, what we're looking to do as we're going through digital transformation, as we're going through any kind of DevOps transformation, increase our velocity whilst maintaining our levels of compliance, control, and quality. There's no point in just going faster for the sake of going faster. There's no point in delivering 500 changes a month when only 5 or 10% of those extra changes are driving business value. So what we need to do is figure out how we can drive all of that change as quickly as possible through our life cycle, through our end-to-end pipeline, whilst maintaining the levels of control that we need to make sure that we don't breach any SLAs, whilst maintaining our compliance requirements, because pretty much all of the customers that I work with on a weekly basis and a yearly basis have significant compliance concerns. If that's organizations in the financial sector, in the insurance sector, in aerospace, in government, if it's in the healthcare sector, if it's in enterprise IT, people require end-to-end deliverables to be tracked and traced so they can provide details to their auditors of how things went from the initial idea through to the production deliverable. And that includes all of the testing capabilities that we deliver along the way. If that's functional testing, if that's regression testing, if that's fully automated testing, if that's API testing, if that's a combination of continuous integration, building our software, and continuous testing and continuous testing capabilities, validating our software, we still need to be able to prove how the end bits and bytes, our new application versions, got into production at any point in time. So taking a look at this transformation dilemma in another way, applying it to your landscape, well, most of our customers have an incredibly complicated landscape. It's not a simple case of one application going from the start to the end of a pipeline, going from the start to the end of a software development lifecycle. Most of our customers have multiple technologies. They have multiple tools to support those technologies. They have mobile systems, they have on-prem systems, they have distributed systems, they have mainframe systems, they have cloud-based systems, they have containerization, they have virtual systems. All of those different systems need to work together to get our applications into production. Our testing will potentially happen in different types of environments than our production systems are running in. Our development tests and our low-level unit tests maybe are running in container environments. As our developers have been more progressive, they've transitioned to working on a continuous integration basis, using containers, maybe Docker or Kubernetes for container management to track the container usage. As they then transition into our formal testing environments, we may be looking at virtualization. As we get into our production environments, we may be looking at physical infrastructure, and across that entire stack, we may be using cloud to augment our pace of delivery to allow us to have enough environment. So how do we track and trace that? Well, from the Micro Focus perspective, our key goal and objective is to help you run and transform your business, to go from where you're at now to DevOps-centric approaches, to digital transformation-centric approaches, and to help you to innovate faster with lower risk. Again, taking that mantra of moving fast without breaking things and applying it to each of your applications across multiple tools and multiple technologies. And to drive that digital transformation, again, from the Micro Focus side, we see things in 4 simple buckets. Enterprise DevOps, which we'll focus a lot on today, hybrid IT management, cloud-centric transformation, and end-to-end lifecycle management from our systems perspective, security, risk, and governance, making sure that everything we do is underpinned by full security capabilities, so there are no vulnerabilities, and getting that security involved in our lifecycle as early as possible, making sure that we can govern everything that's happening across our lifecycle and our application delivery, all the way from initial requests from the business through development, through testing, and into production. And then finally, driving insights into our data, doing predictive analytics, getting data analytics and AI visibility into what's happening, so we can look at patterns, we can look at trends, and we can predict where we're going to have challenges in the future. So that's how Micro Focus sees the world. I guess another way to spin it, rather than taking a circular view of the world of DevOps and building up from there, we could take a more pipeline-centric view of the end-to-end DevOps landscape, where we go from planning and governance through development and testing, through deployment and release, and into operations and monitoring. Again, you'll notice those color blocks, the plan, govern, develop, test, deploy, release, and operate, monitor at the top of the slide, equates to that spinner that we saw earlier on, where product was the center. Basically, everything we're doing has a product focus. Your products, your applications. I pretty much guarantee that there's no one on this call today who only supports a single application from their development, testing, and release perspective. Almost every customer I deal with has in excess of 24 different applications that they develop and test. Some of our customers have in excess of 1,000. In fact, I was in Australia for the last couple of weeks working with some customers down there. One of the customers down there supports 3,800 different applications. And that means that the planning, the development test, the deployment, and the operations phases need to be replicated for each of those applications. And traceability across each of those applications has to be generated and provided, because otherwise you have the ability to be able to deliver changes that don't work across multiple application stacks. And that causes system outages. And again, as we said earlier on, system uptime is critical. We want to make sure that all of our systems are working all the time. So that's a little background into the world of why we're seeing the pressures around DevOps and DevOps transformation. But without further ado, let's jump into some numbers around this. From our perspective, what are we seeing in the marketplace? Well, 60% of our customers are actively utilizing DevOps practices, be that continuous integration, be that agile practices, be that continuous delivery, be that orchestrated release governance. However, less than 40% of the customers that we talk to can actually scale those DevOps practices up to enterprise level. What do I mean by that? So we're seeing 60% adopting DevOps practices, but only 40% of that 60% can actually scale. DevOps practices are easy to apply at a team-centric level. If you've got an individual team or an individual application, you can apply a center of excellence type approach or a practitioner approach, and you can get those guys going very, very quickly, maybe implementing continuous integration, maybe implementing continuous testing, maybe implementing continuous delivery, and maybe even going as far as continuous deployment, getting changes into production hands-free or no ops. But the reality is that can't scale for most of our customers because of cross-application dependencies. Again, when we talk about our customer base, only a third of the applications that are being developed by our customers are being developed and deployed using DevOps-type practices. Again, one of the challenges that we have in enterprise-grade DevOps transformation is you don't just have the cool new stuff, the simple stuff, the microservice-based systems, the container-based systems, the systems running Node.js or Ruby or the latest programming languages. You have applications that have been in your organization for 5, 10, 20, even 30 years. And those applications could be Java-based applications. In fact, if you go back 20 years, Java's been in the market for 20 years. You can have applications that you wrote in the early 2000s. You could have applications running in .NET ecosystems. You can have mainframe applications that go back into the 1980s or even earlier than that. The trouble is we need to help all of those organizational units, all of those application types, transition to DevOps practices to ensure that the business can go successfully to DevOps practices and DevOps transformation application approaches. Why? Well, because systems of constraint say that we're constrained by our slowest moving application. And if we need to deploy an application and it relies upon a mainframe change or a Java change or a .NET change or a Visual C or a C++ change to go with our later technologies, our mobile changes, our app changes, our Node.js changes, we're constrained by the slow-moving application. So we need to apply these practices across the board. We need to try to apply some kind of tool chain dynamic to allow us to align all of our different products and apply the practices that we're going to talk about in a couple of moments' time across the board. Now, before we get into any real definition around process definition and the steps that we'll be following, I'll call out to my colleague Wes. Now, Wes, I know you've seen a number of organizations apply different practices and process areas and DevOps transformation policies. Maybe there's an example or two that you might want to call out at this point as we're about to get into some of these steps that we can follow. Oh, maybe you don't. I don't know, Wes. Maybe you're on mute today or something. But let's continue a little bit.
Sorry. No, that
there we go.
was on mute. Yeah, so that's an experience that I've had as well with our customers is that the large enterprises, they have either entire applications or subcomponents of an application that they would tag as legacy, meaning they can't be modernized because they're on the mainframe and they need to stay on the mainframe because they're secure. But there's always seems to be some piece of an application that stops people from following the quote-unquote purist DevOps adoption, where they can automatically build, test, deploy all the way to production from a code commit. And likewise, there are components of an application that could do that quote-unquote purist DevOps process. So like Julian said, we see a combination of both worlds coming together or trying to come together, and that's why we're talking today.
Exactly. No, and I think that's it's another thing that a lot of folks lose track of as they start reading the books from Jez or Gene or Gary Duvall, Paul Duvall, whoever it happens to be, Gary Groover. It's always looked upon as hey, let's take the low-hanging fruit. Let's take the simple applications that we can transform as quickly as possible. And the reality is, well, yeah, that's how you get stuck in DevOps transformation. You take the simple stuff, you get the value, everyone's happy, and then you try to apply it to the rest of the business, and you didn't think through the nuances of what would happen. So yeah, let's look at some of these steps that can help us get there, and how they apply, and the practices that we need to think about. And the first one seems like a really obvious conversation piece to have: standardizing your end-to-end process. And it's pretty straightforward if you think about it. Every single application within your organization will be following a slightly different process. Why? Because that's the way they've grown up over time. The maturity that we have from an end-to-end perspective is normally pretty much lacking. As we develop and as we implement new applications, what tends to happen is they'll go their own way. Now, what we need to do, first of all, is put the big building blocks in place. Let's put out the big chunks that we need to think about. What phases do we go through? We do our planning, development, our build, our deployment, our testing. We do some more deployments, our testing again, our release and our operations. Those big building blocks should be repeatable for every application. And again, just saying that we've got these big building blocks is one thing. We then need to align those building blocks with the way we actually work on a per application basis. Because what we're looking to do is normalize data. We're looking to normalize the feedback from all of our different applications. And if your applications are all working in different ways, and for example, if they're calling an orange an apple in one environment, and another environment they're calling an orange a banana, it's really difficult to normalize that data. And as you expand and you get up to enterprise scale, it gets more and more difficult to do that. So what we need to do, first of all, is do that high-level process mapping, making sure everyone's working from the same hymn sheet. And again, it looks very traditional in its approach. When I say traditional, almost waterfall-centric. But remember, we're talking about iterating through these individual phases incredibly quickly. We may be going through the planning phase in the space of a sprint planning session. We may be going through our definition phase as part of a sprint activity. We're going through the development, the build, deploy, the test, all as part of a sprint-based activity. Again, using Scrum as an example, that might be a 2-week iteration that we're going through that process. So we're doing this in increments very, very quickly. We're doing continuous assessment. And the key being the word continuous. Getting into that continuous testing phase. When we come out of our sprints, we're going to do some kind of verification. Again, in the purest world, this process would go all the way from end to end in a 2-week cycle. Now that's great if your application is standalone and has no dependencies and has no lag and has no constraints. But in the reality of the grown-up world, the enterprise world, where we have some applications that can work at that, but most are still stuck with legacy delivery and release cycles, what we end up doing is that continuous testing through to continuous monitoring and that continuous delivery through to release governance phase is actually doing a more stage-based delivery. And we'll see this later on as we talk in a little bit more detail. But stage-based delivery is important because it allows us to iterate quickly through lower-level environments, doing our unit testing, doing our verification process, doing our first phase integration test, and then do more structured testing and verification through later phases of our life cycle. Again, as we're looking at standardizing development processes, we need to look at standardizing test processes and standardizing operational processes across all of our application areas. Now, the challenge with this is we're changing people's working practices, and of course, that means people complain. That means people don't want to work the same way. Well, why is it important? Well, as we've seen, development teams have their own systems. They're working in their own systems. They're working in their Jiras, or they're working in their version 1s, or they're working in their rallies, or they're working in their ALM octanes. They have their systems that do their things, and they support their own process types. And we see the transition, from V model to waterfall to agile, or maybe to Scrum type agile processes. And we have practices that we need to support. Maybe that's ISO 26262 for automotive, or maybe it's ISO 9001 for a broad span IT engineering, or CMM or CM2. Or automotive SPICE or DoD practices. But those processes have been in place for a while, and so are our testing team processes. We have our test processes that we've been following. We have data-driven testing. We have keyword-based testing. We have hybrid testing. We have BDD testing. We have to support policies around ISO or ISEC or IEEE. Again, SPICE has its own specific testing processes. We're in the automotive space. So testing teams have been working in their own tooling For example, they may have been working in ALMQC, or they may have been working in Selenium, or they may have been working in Tricentis, or they may have been working in any manner of different tools, but they're segregated a lot of the times from the development tooling. And likewise, operations-wise, operations teams have their own systems. They have their ServiceNows or their Remedies or their ITSMX systems, and they have their own processes as well. For example, they're SLA driven, or they're working with theory of constraint, or they're working with ITIL-based practices. Again, a lot of our customers over the last 15 years have gone down the ITIL route on the operational side, and that leads to a process mismatch. We have dev processes, we have test processes, we have operations processes, and we need to find a way to glue them together from a common process framework perspective. Again, simply standardizing processes across the board is a great way to start. Then we need to think about how do we map the processes. For example, if we're doing agile practices on the dev and test side, how do we map that to ITIL-based service transition and service delivery on the operations side? And we have some capabilities through some product lines and some transformation policies that we can apply process mapping. So, for example, our governance tooling around release and release control will allow us to map those processes. So ops and dev are speaking the same language, even though they're using their own tools, and they have a standardized framework to work within. Again, we're not telling the ops guys to use dev tooling. We're not telling the dev guys or the testers to use ops tooling, because they perform specific functions. We just map them together. We orchestrate the tools together, which allows those tools and those frameworks to interact with each other. Again, something I mentioned earlier on was this whole notion of stage gate-based approaches and continuous delivery practices working with ITIL or stage gate. Again, what we've seen with a lot of our more progressive customers, as they've gone down the continuous delivery DevOps route, they're implementing practices like continuous integration. So the dev teams will check in some code. That code will drive a build. That build will be automatically tested using our unit tests, our JUnit, our NUnit, our API tests. Those tests will then succeed, hopefully. If that build is successful, we'll have a candidate which goes into our integration environment. And of course, that integration environment will then be available for our testing, and we'll run our test automation or manual testing. Our continuous delivery process would automate as much of that as possible. But we'll then have stage gates, we'll have holding patterns that all of our different applications will apply to, because we're not just looking at these changes from a single application perspective. We may be looking at one application, 10 applications, 50 applications, 500 applications that all need to shift into UAT and production together. And by gating and having stage gate approaches, we can apply practices to allow us to consolidate, to hold all these applications, to track their dependencies, to verify their dependencies, to provide insight into those dependencies. So if a change gets pulled from one system and that's going to impact another, we can get visibility into that. So we don't break our testing ecosystem. So we don't break our testing execution. And of course, as we do continuous delivery, one of the other things we'll start seeing is we'll need more testing environments. The number of times I have conversations with customers who say, yeah, going faster from dev is great, but how do I keep up from the testing perspective? If I'm building every time I commit some code, I don't have enough test environments. So then we start looking at provisioning of infrastructure environments, which is something we'll come back to later on. So looking at continuous delivery, ITIL and stage gate, again, Wes, any thoughts or comments around the stage gate approach to delivering applications and examples that you've seen?
No, you actually hit on it. We've talked to customers who will walk in there and they say they're doing DevOps already. When we, they say they've got their DevOps pipeline completely implemented. And when we look into it, what they actually have is to the left of that first blue gate there, where Julian has Dev CI integration environment or integration testing mapped out. That is actually the only piece that they have their DevOps pipeline integrated for, or continuously built out to. And then they hand it off to a different team and to a different team. But when you ask anybody who's in the Dev, CI, or integration world, they'll tell you, I have my application DevOps. It's done. There is nothing else to do. And then we start talking about the conversation about the idea that DevOps is really about bringing these other teams farther down the pipeline into the process so that things can flow faster, whether it's doing things with automation or doing things with visibility so that when the time comes, it moves and flows faster. That's the only thing I was going to add.
Cool, thanks for that. No, it makes perfect sense. And again, what we see in a lot of our customers is this going faster and faster in the lower level environment, making sure it's suitable to go to the higher level environments. Again, for most of our customers, UAT is an expensive resource to bring in from the business to do our formal testing. So we need to make sure that everything really is properly aligned and good to go. And then it's a true precursor to pre-prod or staging or production, whichever environment we happen to have. Again, this simplistic life cycle obviously only calls out one environment here for UAT, but we could have multiple environments that they're going through in sequence or in parallel, and that's before we start looking at deployment patterns into these environments as well. So, okay, we've looked at one step, which is standardization across the board, standardizing our processes, standardizing our approach, and then doing our process mapping. The next thing is looking at pipeline implementation. And a pipeline is pretty simple to describe. It's basically the way that your application flows from any idea that comes in from the business to production delivery and what we call here monetization. There's a pretty great example of what you can do to track the lead time for your application delivery. You can take a change and make an idea of some kind and track it from how long it takes to come from your business user. So say, hey, Mr. Business User, submit this dummy change for me. We'll track it and we'll go all the way through our life cycle and we'll see how long it takes. And in high-performing organizations, we're looking at a transaction time through all environments of less than 2 weeks for that change. Now, for most organizations, it's significantly longer than that. But for a simple change, you should be able to do it as quickly as possible. Indeed, in true high-performing organizations that have implemented practices around continuous integration, continuous delivery, even continuous deployment, you could be looking at a sub-day transaction time there. But that's the remit of organizations who basically the application is the business. They don't have to look at dependencies or synchronization across multiple applications. But taking this notion of an idea, going through hey, I need to plan it. It needs to appear in some kind of backlog or some kind of release, or it needs to be put into a functional design spec to then go into our development teams to iterate through our build practices, to iterate through our integration practices, to go through our formal testing environment, to be deployed into those environments, to then be tested again through all the environments in our pipeline, to be released and then tracked into our production environment. That is our deployment pipeline. Again, synonymous pretty much with a software development lifecycle, going from the notion of ideation to monetization. And again, from your perspective as end consumers, and as customers and as people who are practitioners within the DevOps space, what you'll notice is you have multiple pipelines. You'll have multiple pipelines for different kinds of applications. And the speed that you can go through those pipelines will vary. It's almost like a sliding scale. Some of your applications can go incredibly quickly. Let's say the new applications, the mobile applications with its low touch. There's some dependencies on back-end systems, but most things are abstracted through APIs, so you can go pretty quickly left to right. And then you get through into your legacy systems, you get through into your back office systems, your SAP systems, your ERP tooling, where there's much greater integration with a load of different systems, where you have a lot of traditional, not API-based integrations, but programmatic integrations potentially, a huge amount of reporting and back-end tooling that are based upon these systems. So you'll see different speeds of delivery through these pipelines, but ultimately we're looking to standardize the pipeline flow. Now, not all applications will go to all environments. Again, there are reasons why some applications won't go to every single environment that you might have in your organization, and that's fine, as long as the pipeline flow works in the same way. Because ultimately what we're trying to do with that pipeline flow is take a few simple steps. We're trying to define what our results should be from the outset. And then we're trying to make the visibility of the work that takes place across that flow. Again, I think that simple example, gives your business analyst to change and see how long it takes to go through the process. Part of that is making the work visible. What actually happens? Are you pushing paper around? Is everything electronic? Are you tracking everything that's going through your process? How do you limit the work in progress time? How do you reduce the transaction time between different phases? So when your business analyst hands it over to your project manager or your scrum master who hands it over to an end user or a developer to do the implementation, who then transitions it over to a tester to do testing, how do you limit the amount of time and waste that you've got in that process? What else do? We look to increase the deployment frequency, so making that change as small as possible so we can do many small changes rather than one big change. We're trying to reduce the number of handoffs, getting the pipeline aligned as quickly as possible and as easily as possible, so there aren't 5 different handoffs to go from development to test. It goes straight from the developer to the right tester, to the person who actually understands that part of the business, that part of the application, without having to go to a manager and a sub-manager and a sub-sub-manager to then go down to the person who actually does the work. And ultimately eliminate waste from our end-to-end pipeline and process flow. Because as part of this pipeline optimization, we want to make sure we're working on the right thing. We want to take the manual effort out. We want to take away the inappropriate time and the wasted time with handoffs, with meetings and failed deployments, and we want to reduce the number of production incidents that we're seeing. And again, aligning everything across the board, making sure that our testing is executing against the right parts of the business. From a testing perspective, it's very expensive to write test automation. What we don't want to do is write test automation and have 100% coverage on a part of the application that never changes. Why? Well, because there's no value to all of that test automation. If there's a part of the business we can identify very rarely changes, maybe 30 or 40% coverage will be enough to give us confidence that that application component hasn't changed. We want to be focusing our automation efforts on the parts of the business that are undergoing significant and fundamental change. Why? Because then we're testing value, then we're testing what has actually changed, rather than just going through regression cycles and continuously testing that, hey, this button in the top right corner is still in the top right corner. As we go through our release and deployment processes, we want to make sure we've got the right number of environments to deploy our applications into, so we can release more and more rapidly, we can deploy our applications, and our testers aren't waiting for environments to become available. Again, a customer example that I can think of, there's a large bank out of the UK where they had a 6-week cycle, 6 months would be even worse, but a 6-week cycle for the testers to actually be able to test the software because they had infrastructure provisioning requirements. Developers were done, the code would sit there, their application build would sit there for 6 weeks as they provision new infrastructure to then be able to deploy their applications and test into. Through the use of automation, through the use of provisioning of application environments, through the application deployments being automated, they reduced that to a 4-hour window. Basically, that 4-hour was the whole period of time where the provisioning was taking place. We're not talking about a single small server being provisioned. We're talking about multiple servers with multiple database dependencies, with full data set provisioning, with full data implementation, with API services calling out to other systems being set up and configured. So it wasn't just a simple case of, hey, spin up a new server, we're good to go. An incredibly complicated ecosystem for this testing to take place again. And again, probably similar to the environments that you work in. It's never a case of, hey, give me a container with everything that's ready to go. It's, hey, give me an ecosystem that mimics my true production system with 50 or 100 servers, with all of our application dependencies, all of our data constraints, all of our data dependencies. Taking that from 6 weeks to 4 hours makes a significant reduction in the whole waiting for handoffs, waiting for manual efforts, and waiting for solutions to be verified. There's a few ways that we can go about this. And again, Wes, maybe you've got some other examples of customers who've done this kind of thing, where they've implemented practices around automation and reduction of time and lean process improvement.
Yeah, we had a customer that used to have what they called the $1 million conference call, where everybody from around the country in their different respective regions were on a conference call, taking turns performing their certain actions, whether it was standing up a server, configuring a database in preparation for a script to be run, and then somebody running the script. Everybody had a different job, and everybody was on the clock on this conference call waiting for their turn. So it literally was costing them up to $1 million to run a deployment, even in a pre-production environment. And so automating that, obviously, they were able to then execute tasks in parallel as well as sequentially, so they could plan things ahead of time, get everybody's approval, and then at deployment time, they could execute it without keeping everybody on the line. So that's where they got the savings with automation.
That's pretty cool. And I guess, through that whole process, they also ended up with sort of visibility into what was happening as well.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And in fact, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I think the run book or the sequence of doing these releases to pre-production and production had over 800 individual tasks that they would have to run and go off and do this updates and go off and by, just like what I said, by automating, but also getting that orchestration of different tools from a single place and then getting visibility across all those tools, it gave them one place to look at the status of the releases and the deployments. Has all of our testing been verified? Has our deployment to our UAT environment succeeded? Have we run our APM tests against our systems? Have we done our functional tests? And again, part of these deployments could be waiting and sitting for our testers to actually perform manual test execution. Again, in the real world, in the enterprise space, it's not a case of being able to automate the entire path to production. Sometimes you have to have manual interaction points. And again, getting orchestration and visibility across what's happening from those manual steps is pretty much just as important as being able to implement automation to drive the end-to-end process. Okay, let's look at some practices that we can implement. Well, obviously, there's the notion of continuous integration, which basically allows us to say, as soon as a developer commits their change, we're going to push that into a version control system or a source control server. We're going to push that straight away into our build system or pull it from our build system. Our build's going to run. We're going to run automated testing. It'll succeed or fail. If it succeeds, we'll push it into our artifact repository. If it fails, we'll flag our build as failure. But either way, our developer's going to get notified because we have a feedback loop. And it allows us to get unit testing done as part of our developer commit process, pushing the testing remit to the left, shifting left with our testing. And of course, we can build things like our security scans into this. We can do code reviews as part of this CI build process. Now, our CI build process can lead into our continuous delivery practices, where we're doing our CI build, developer commit, build happens, unit testing, verification, code scanning, check style, review of our code, success drives, the artifact repository update, and then we deploy using automation into our integration environment. And that automation into our integration environment allows our system to sit there. If we have automated deployments, we can continue into UAT. If we have an approval gate, we can gate the delivery to UAT. And again, that might be sitting there waiting for a tester to say, hey, I'm going to click this button and now update my UAT environment, and then all the way into production. That leads us into the continuous testing notion, where we're doing continuous delivery, but our test automation server is triggered on each environment. So our test automation server or servers across multiple domains will actually run test executions automatically and be triggered by our automated deployment. So our CI build will trigger our test automation. Our deployment into integration will trigger our test automation. Our deployment into UAT will trigger our test automation. Maybe even our production deployment using our automation will then trigger test automation, because we want to do some smoke tests or sanity tests once production is there. That's above and beyond any verification we do with our application performance monitoring tool sets, which ultimately leads us into this realm of continuous deployment, where we're doing zero-touch, no-touch deployment to production. But for most of our customers, again, maybe except a specific application or two, it's way, way beyond the scope of what they'd want to look with, which ultimately gets us to a point where we can have a continuous testing flow, where we're building out our system. We commit our test cases are done, we deploy, we put into our integration test environment, we deploy into our SIT environment. All the way we're tracking our tests and querying our results, we're making sure everything's working fine. We run our tests, we get into QA, we deploy, we test, we deploy into staging, we test, maybe even deploy to production, and then we verify what's happening. Along the board, we're checking and validating everything that's happening. We're able to see from our testing tool and solution our test results. Obviously, what we're able to do then through some of our technology like our ALM or Obtain technology is hook all of that information back into our CI build system. We're able to hook it into our end-to-end visibility flow, and through our automation technology, our deployment automation, we're able to drive these deployments and drive these tests. So we can implement this continuous testing flow where we're continuously delivering, we're continuously testing, we're verifying, and we're using that as the stage gate to push us into the next environment. And I guess just to hit the next level up, and it builds on what we were just talking with this whole notion of continuous delivery and continuous testing. We need to get to the realm where we're looking at automating everything. We're looking at automation across the board. We're looking at automating our applications. We're looking at automating our testing. We're looking at change configuration automation, or CCA as it's called out on this particular slide. Change configuration automation, that's infrastructure provisioning. Provisioning net new infrastructure, if that's container-based, if it's physical, if it's virtual, if it's cloud-based, using automation without the need for a manual or an end user to go in and provision, no IT guy needing to go in to create new infrastructure, no developer resource needing to get involved in the provision of that infrastructure, just simply having a click of a button where we can provision some infrastructure. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a couple of moments' time. Same thing with our database, provisioning our database, taking our data. And again, one of the key things as we're working on our testing ecosystem is making sure we've got the correct test data, taking data from our production systems, purging it, cleansing it, normalizing that data, taking away any data that shouldn't be in there, so we're fully GDPR compliant, making sure that our database is fully set and ready to go before we push our applications out there and then run our test execution, because obviously our data fix is one of the reasons that our testing can fail, needing to purge and clean data. So we want to make sure it's as good as possible. And of course, automation takes away a huge amount of risk across the board. It takes away manual interaction, and humans are fallible. They make mistakes. They introduce risk. What we're trying to do, because we're trying to go faster and faster with our delivery, is we're trying to take away any mistakes. We're trying to reduce the risk. We're trying to increase the velocity. We're increasing our quality because we've taken the risks. And again, because we're repeating everything through all of our environments. And of course, it gives us visibility into what's happened across the board. We can see how all of our applications were deployed through our different environments very, very simply and easily. And we can use technologies like our deployment automation technology, which hooks straight into all of our testing tools. It hooks into our CI build tools. It hooks into our release orchestration tools to drive that automation across the board. It allows us to do infrastructure provisioning, cloud, physical, virtual, or container-based. And it has a full plug-in capability system, which allows us to hook into all kinds of different tools across the board. Now, Wes, maybe there's some stuff around infrastructure and infrastructure provisioning you want to talk about here.
Yeah, depending upon your infrastructure, we've done things with customers who are using Micro Focus orchestrated operations, formerly HPOO. We've done some work there. If you're using containers, we've done some integrations with Docker, using Docker directly, or even using something like Chef. We've worked with customers doing that. Depending upon what infrastructure looks like for you and what you have in place today to help manage that, we, like Julian was just showing, we have various plugins to help automate that, make it part of the automation deployment.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we've seen in the past is where customers are provisioning testing environments, and there's maybe some stuff around that. You know, it's kind of important to have enough testing environments to be able to work with.
Yeah, you know, on that note, there's a big part of customer adoption around you know, static environments and transitioning that to more of a dynamic environment. For a lot of customers where their quality environments, their quality control environments are static, or, you know, even if they are dynamic, they don't necessarily want the latest version up and running because they haven't completed their testing run or the test execution of the previous version. So if I'm this week focused on running version 3.0 through the ringer, finding all the bugs I can, I don't want development turning over version 3.1 without me knowing it and updating the environment. So as a quality manager managing that process, I can manage the intake with like a tool like deployment automation. I can manage the intake from the developers and control when that goes to my quality controlled environment. So that way my testers know what version is up and running in the environment, so they know what functionality they need to be testing. That way, if I'm managing some feature differently in version 3.1 and my tests haven't been written yet, then when I'm testing 3.0, I don't want somebody deploying 3.1 because I'm going to get a bunch of false failures. So that's what we see customers using deployment automation for.
Oh, yeah, and that allows obviously automation deployments, automation of infrastructure, automation of tests, all from a single point of visibility and control, which is kind of important, which allows us to do this whole full stack automation. You know, everything from the ground up, provision the OS, provision the applications, configure the applications, automate the testing of the applications, going from next to nothing to a full stack in again in a lot of instances in a matter of minutes, which really speeds our time to market. It allows us to have testing environments of ecosystems ready to go, and allows us to throw them away once we're done. And of course, it ties into some of the challenges we see. Sorry, Wes, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so you hit it on the head, right? A big part of the automation, right, is when you are automating testing. If that's your bottleneck, you automate testing, then we can automate the entire process of getting it ready to test. So we automate the configuration of the infrastructure to deploying the application, then executing a set of regression tests and potentially the new tests you've written for to test the new functionality. And with that then comes an automated response of whether this particular build is quality, meaning has it passed all of my tests that I've specified for it. And so then that can then automate and become a potential release candidate. So this helps you move more towards that continuous deployment where I am finding either it's build errors, deployment errors, or test errors sooner in the process. And like Julian pointed out there in the previous slide where we're automating the full stack, another part of, or the value that you're getting with automation of the deployment is when I deploy to an environment, I can identify a deployment error if there's going to be one with my application. That way, when I go to production, if I'm automating it and deploying it the same way in between test environments and production environments, when I go to production, I've already identified any potential deployment errors. One of the things we haven't talked about today was those deployment errors. You know, we talked about finding testing errors in the application or quality issues, but there's also the automation of the deployment where you find deployment errors that you can then remediate and make sure they don't show up when you go to production.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the great values of automation. So, yeah, let's skip over to what comes next. I guess from our side, you know, the whole transformation to DevOps practices, the journey. You know, you need to look at the three core constituent areas that we've talked around today: the standardization of processes, the implementation of pipelines, and then automation to help you to get there. And across the way, what you'll see is, you know, a number of quick early wins, and then there'll be the much harder problems. And one of the differences that we try to apply is try to solve the hard problems first, because otherwise, you know, you end up with a point where the business objective change. People no longer see the need to get into the realms of fixing the difficult problems. It's move on to some other technology. So, yeah, let's make sure we can support all of the adoption pipeline type approaches. Ultimately, we end up with this whole notion of a journey through time. And from one of our customers, you know, they did a lot of work. They did some shift glass testing. They embedded security consultants. They got into embedded ops, and they're getting to the point where they're much closer to where they need to be. But it's a long running process. It's not something that you can implement in a matter of hours. And it lines into this whole notion of a technology value stream, which is a follow-on conversation that we can have at some point. But basically going from ideation through to delivery as quickly as possible, and tracking and tracing across the board there, implementing practices like lean process management and continuous delivery, and taking waste out of our end-to-end process. So yeah, I guess from our perspective, you can learn more on our Micro Focus website. There's a load of information out there. There's actually an ebook that you can download which talks around DevOps and continuous delivery practices. The guy who wrote it obviously seemed to know what he was doing, so he wrote something pretty impressive in that book. But yeah, take a look at enterprise DevOps from the Micro Focus perspective, and you'll see quite a lot of additional content out there. Jay, over to you. I think there may be some questions that have come in as we've been talking.
Yeah. So hopefully you can still hear me, but I do have a handful of questions. I don't know if we'll get through them all, so let me just take them in the order I see them in the question and answer box. So the first one says, we have about 15–20% of test automation coverage. Will this stop us implementing the practices we have heard discussed today?
Oh, I think I can grab that one if you want, Wes. Yeah, I mean, test automation and what we're talking about here from the DevOps transformation perspective are kind of aligned, but there's no hard dependence on test automation. So yeah, you can use the application automation, you can use the infrastructure automation, the end-to-end lifecycle approaches that we've discussed, and then build out your testing as you need to in your test coverage.
Excellent. And I'll jump on one more question and then we'll respond to them and follow up. But the next one says, do we have any kind of performance center plugins for some of the deployment type solutions in the industry? I don't know if you want to handle that, Wes.
Yeah, I can take on that as well. So yeah, we have plugins to Performance Center from our deployment automation technology, which allows us to basically implement a pipeline-based approach and execute our performance testing as part of that pipeline, which again, from the practices we've discussed today, trying to shift left as much as possible, trying to implement an end-to-end flow that's as seamless as possible, allows us to hook fully into performance and call that out if that's in a performance environment specifically, or if that's earlier in the life cycle, we can choose as we drive it through our plugins.
Excellent. So we have 1 minute left, so I want to go ahead and wrap this up. So first of all, we want to make sure that you're aware of the upcoming Vivid events, and this is the links basically to go ahead and sign up for them. You can also go to the website. And the next slide is going to show us really the roadshow of events that we're putting out for our customers. And this will have a roadshow where the first half of the day we're talking about our IT operations management solution, and the second half of the day is around the application delivery management presentation. And it's going to be in several cities. Please go to the link on the page or go to the Vivid website and find that link, and you can get more information and see if it's coming to a city near you. And then finally, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and to be sure to complete the short survey after the webinar ends. And again, just a quick reminder that this is an on-demand recording, slide deck, and everything will be available on the Vivid website in the next few days, and you will receive an email for those links. And then finally, again, thanking you for today's attendance to our webinar, and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.